This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. New Discoveries at Jamestown by John L. Cotter and J. Paul Hudson. Part 1. Exploration. The ground yields many things. Now, during the course of this reading, I will tell you where an illustration has been inserted. Part 1 begins with a quotation by Lord Bacon, as follows. As in the arts and sciences, the first invention is of more consequence than all the improvements afterward, so in kingdoms, the first foundation or plantation is of more noble dignity and merit than all that followeth. End of quote. In the summer of 1934, a group of archaeologists set to work to explore the site of the first permanent English settlement at Jamestown Island, Virginia. For the next 22 years, the National Park Service strove, with time out for wars and intervals between financial allotments, to wrest from the soil of Jamestown the physical evidence of 17th century life. The job is not yet complete. Only 24 out of 60 acres estimated to comprise James City have been explored, yet a significant amount of information has been revealed by trowel and whisk broom and careful recording. By 1956, a total of 140 structures, brick houses, frame houses with brick footings, outbuildings, workshops, wells, kilns, and even a nice storage pit, have been recorded. To help unravel the mystery of landholdings, sometimes marked by ditches, 96 ditches of all kinds were located, and hundreds of miscellaneous features from post holes to brick walls were uncovered. Refuse pits were explored meticulously, since before the dawn of history man has left his story in the objects he discarded. When archaeology at Jamestown is mentioned, the question is often asked, why was it necessary to treat so famous a historic site as an archaeological problem at all? Isn't the story finished with the accounts of John Smith's adventures, the romance of John Rolfe and Pocahontas, the Starving Time, the Indian Massacre of 1622, Nathaniel Bacon's rebellion against Governor Berkeley, and the establishment of the first Legislative Assembly? The archaeologist's answer is that the real drama of daily life of the settlers, the life they knew 24 hours a day, is locked in the unwritten history beneath humus and tangled vegetation of the island. Here a thimble from the ruins of a cottage still retains a pellet of paper to keep it on a tiny finger that wore it 300 years ago. A bent halberd in an abandoned well, a discarded sword, and a piece of armor tell again the passing of terror of the unknown after the Indians retreated forever into the distant hills and forests. Rust-eaten axes, wedges, mattocks, and saws recall the struggle to clear a wilderness. The simple essentials of life in the first desperate years have largely vanished, with traces of the first fort and its frame buildings. But in later houses, the evidence of Venetian glass, Dutch and English Delftware, pewter and silver eating utensils, and other comforts and little luxuries tell of new-found security and the beginning of wealth. In all, 500,000 individual artifacts at the Jamestown Museum represent the largest collection from any 17th century colonial site in North America. But archaeologists have found more than objects at Jamestown. They sought to unravel the mystery of that part of the first settlement which disappeared beneath the eroding current of the James River during the past 300 years. It has always been known that the island in the 17th century was connected to the mainland by a narrow isthmus extending to Glasshouse Point, where a glassmaking venture took place in 1608. Over this isthmus the great road ran, and its traces have been discovered on the island as far as the brick church tower. As the isthmus disappeared at the close of the 17th century, the river continued to erode the island headward and build it up at its downstream end, so that the western and southern shores, where the first settlement had been built, were partly destroyed. Thus, the first fort site of 1607, of which no trace has been found on land, is thought to have been eaten away, together with the old powder magazine and much early 17th century property fronting on the river. In a series of extensive tests for any possible trace of the 1607 fort still remaining on land, several incidental discoveries of importance were made. One was an Indian occupation site beneath a layer of early 17th century humus, which in turn was covered by the earthen rampart of a Confederate fort of 1861. This location is marked today by a permanent in-place exhibit on the shore near the old church tower. Here, in a cut-away earth section revealing soil zones from the present to the undisturbed clay, evidence of 350 years of history fades away into prehistory. Within the enclosure of this same Confederate fort was found a miraculously preserved pocket of 17th century debris marking the site of the earliest known armorer's forge in British America. Just beyond, upriver, lies ruins of the Ludwell House and the 3rd and 4th State Houses. In 1900 to 1901, Colonel Samuel H. Young, a U.S. Army engineer and a keen student of Jamestown history, uncovered and capped these foundations after building the original seawall. A strange discovery was made here in 1955 while the foundations were being examined by archaeologists for measured drawings. Tests showed that no less than 70 human burials lay beneath the State House walls, and an estimated 200 more remain undisturbed beneath the remaining structures or have been lost in the James River. Here may be the earliest cemetery yet revealed at Jamestown, one so old that it was forgotten by the 1660s when the 3rd State House was erected. It is indeed quite possible that these burials, some hastily interred without coffins, could date from the starving time of 1609 to 1610, when the settlers strove to dispose of their dead without disclosing their desperate condition to the Indians. Here is inserted an illustration entitled Jamestown Exploration Trenches of 1955 from the air, landmarks of the old cypress in the river, upper left, the Tercentenary Monument, and the standing ruin of the 18th century Ambler House. End of caption. The highlight of archaeological discoveries at Jamestown is undoubtedly the long-forgotten buildings themselves, ranging from mansions to simple cottages. Since no accurate map of 17th century James City is known to survive, and as only a few land tracts, often difficult to adjust to the ground, have come down to us, archaeologists found that the best way to discover evidence was to cast a network of exploratory trenches over the area of habitation. During its whole century of existence, the settlement was never an integrated town. The first frame houses quickly rotted away or succumbed to frequent fires. Brick buildings were soon erected, but probably not 20 ever stood at one time during the 17th century. Bearing in mind that the massive church tower is the only 17th century structure remaining above ground today, and the only building whose identity was therefore never lost, you will find only one other identified with positive assurance, the Ludwell House, 3rd and 4th State Houses Row. The remaining 140 structures so far discovered by excavating have no clear-cut identity with their owners. To complicate matters more, bricks from many burned or dismantled houses were salvaged for reuse, sometimes leaving only vague soil shadows for the archaeologist to ponder. From artifacts associated with foundation traces, relative datings, and, usually, the use of the structure can be deduced from physical evidence. Unless a contemporaneous map is someday found, we shall know little more than this about the houses at Jamestown, except for the testimony of assorted hardware, ceramics, glassware, metalware, and other imperishable reminders of 17th century arts and crafts. Churches. The first church service at Jamestown was held under a piece of sailcloth in May 1607. The first frame church, constructed within the palisades, burned with the entire first fort in January 1608, and was eventually replaced by another frame structure after the fort was rebuilt. The exact date of the first church to stand on a brick foundation is uncertain, possibly 1639. Brick foundation traces, uncovered in 1901 by John Tyler, Jr., a civil engineer who volunteered his services for the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, lie behind the freestanding brick church tower which remains the only standing ruin today. The modern brick structure and roof enclose and protect the footing evidence of the walls of two separate churches and a tiled chancel flooring. Indication of fire among these foundations was noted by Tyler. Illustration caption: a mansion structure of public building dating from the second quarter of the 17th century, rebuilt once and burned about the time of Bacon's Rebellion, 1676. End of caption. Mansions. Despite official urgings that they build substantial townhouses on Jamestown Island, the first successful planters often preferred to build on their own holdings away from the capital, once the Indian menace had passed. Only 2 houses at Jamestown, designed for single occupancy, have over 900 square feet of foundation area. One was either a stately residence or a public building, area 1,350 square feet, located near Pitch and Tar Swamp, just east of the Jamestown Visitors Center. Archaeological evidence indicates that this structure was first completed before the middle of the 17th century. It was later reconstructed and enlarged about the beginning of the last quarter, possibly during Bacon's Rebellion of 1676. Unmistakably, it burned. The second structure was a smaller, 1,200 square feet, but imposing house located near the present shoreline, considerably downriver. One of the features of this second mansion was a basement in the center of which was sunk a square, brick-lined recess, 3.3 feet on a side and 2.7 feet deep. Among the many wine bottle fragments in this recess were 3 bottle seals, one with WW and 2 with FN stamped on them. Whether or not this mansion can be associated with Sir Francis Nicholson, the last governor resident at Jamestown, who moved the capital to Williamsburg, we do not know. Artifacts found in the refuse indicate this house was dismantled, not burned, shortly before or after the turn of the 17th century. The mystery of the little brick-lined recess is not entirely solved, but it is probable that here was a primitive cooler deep below the house in which perishable foods or wines were stored. Illustration caption: Jamestown house types: simple frame, half timber, brick, and row. Conjectural sketches by Sidney E. King. End of caption. Another illustration caption: excavated foundation of a late 17th century prototype of the Baltimore and Philadelphia row houses. 6 families could have lived here. End of caption. Row houses. Although row houses, a continuous row of joined family residences on unit foundations, were a common city feature in 17th century England, apparently they did not become popular at Jamestown. But the brick foundation of one true multiple family unit has been uncovered, and 2 others approach this category, thus providing the true precedent for the row houses which came to characterize miles of Baltimore and Philadelphia streets, and are a familiar pattern of some modern duplex apartment units. This Jamestown row house is probably the most impressive foundation on the island. It is 16 feet long and 20 feet wide, inside measurement, situated east of the Tercentenary Monument, facing south, well back from the river and the back street. A cellar and a great fireplace terminate the east end, and 9 other fireplaces are evident in 4 main divisions, which may have housed 1 family or more in each division. Since artifact evidence relates it to the last quarter of the 17th century, and possibly the beginning of the 18th, there would seem little possibility of the row house having served as a public building or a tavern. There is some evidence that at least part of the structure burned. Two other foundations might be classed as row houses, but are less clearly delineated. One is the last State House group of 5 units in the APVA grounds. Footnote 1. After the third State House burned, it was replaced on the same foundations by the fourth and last State House, built on Jamestown Island, which burned in 1698. The fifth State House, now reconstructed at Williamsburg, also burned, continuing an unhappy tradition that includes the destruction of the national capital at Washington in 1814 and the Virginia State House at Richmond in 1865. End of footnote. The other multiple house is a 3-unit building midway between the brick church and Orchard Run. This structure generally fits the description of the first State House in its 3-unit construction and dimensions, and has long been thought to be the original State House building. The structure, however, is as close to the present shoreline as the first State House is recorded to have been in 1642, a puzzling coincidence if the factor of erosion is taken into consideration. Single brick houses. These were once supposed to have been very common at Jamestown, but are represented by only 12 foundations, not all of which have been completely excavated. Like the other excavated structures, if these houses can be related to the ownership of the land tracts on which they once stood, we may someday know more of their possible identity. Frame houses. Partial or even whole brick footings do not always indicate brick houses at Jamestown. Some 30 structures have been recorded which had brick footings or isolated brick fireplace foundations, the appearance of which suggests frame houses. These may be briefly classified as follows: brick or brick and cobble, wall footings with central chimney bases of brick, 2. Brick footing and outside chimney, 3. Brick footing only, 10. Brick chimney base alone remaining, 12. Stone footing only, 1. Cellar only, presumed to belong to frame or unfinished house, or to have had all bricks salvaged, 1. Burned earth floor area only remaining, presumed to mark a frame house, 1. Some of the structures encountered in the first explorations remain to be more fully excavated and recorded. Structures in this category total 23. Miscellaneous structures. Because of the inadequacy of Jamestown remains and records, it is difficult to determine the purposes for which the various outbuildings were used. Doubtless, many outbuildings did exist for various purposes, and probably most of them were not substantial enough to leave a trace. Two clearly isolated, small structures properly called outbuildings, discovered in 1955, are all that will be cited here. The first is the large double chimney foundation just beyond the southwest corner of the mansion east of the museum. Undoubtedly this belonged to a detached kitchen. The second is a small but thick-walled rectangular structure of brick which may have been a food storehouse or even a powder magazine. Illustration caption. Although most Jamestown workshops were probably made of framework and were merely sheds, one brick foundation has 3 brick fireboxes and a large brick chimney. This structure was probably a brew house, bakery, or distillery. End of caption. Workshop structures. Most of the early industries at Jamestown were undoubtedly housed in perishable wooden structures that have left the least evident traces, such as frame sheds for forges and wine presses, carpenters' shops, and buildings used by various artisans and craftsmen. So far, only 2 industrial structures are clearly recognizable, aside from kilns, although their precise use is not certain. One of these, on the edge of Pitch and Tar Swamp, was a nearly square, tile-floored workshop with a rough but substantial brick foundation, supporting the framework of the walls. On the floor were 3 fireboxes, 2 of which were associated with a large chimney area. What was fabricated here has not yet been determined, although ceramic firing, brewing, distilling, and even ironworking have been suggested. Proximity of pottery and lime-burning kilns, and a small pit where iron may have been smelted, may be significant. A second, very fragmentary brick foundation close to the present river bank suggests a shop rather than a house, but lacks firebox evidence or other identifying features. It may be 18th rather than 17th century. Illustration caption. Near the foundation of the probable bake shop, a pair of kilns once served for slaking lime and perhaps for firing pottery. Between the kilns was a flame-scarred pit containing evidence of ironworking and the roasting of bog ore for iron. End of caption. Brick walks or paved areas. It is difficult to assign a use for certain areas which have been paved apparently with brick rubble, or in more evident cases by flat-laid bricks. 4 such paved areas have been discovered. Brick drains. 3 brick drains buried beneath the humus line are identified with 17th century houses. Ice storage pit. So far unique on Jamestown Island is a circular unlined pit, 14 feet in top diameter, excavated 7 feet into a sandy substratum, and corresponding in general character to known 17th and 18th century ice pits in England. This pit, which lies 250 feet east of the visitor center, may have served a spacious house which once stood nearby. It may be assumed that the missing surface structure was circular, probably of brick, had a small door, and was roofed over with thatch or sod for insulation. Kilns. Both brick and lime kilns are present in the James City area, each type being represented by 4 examples. The oldest of 4 brick kilns so far discovered on the island is a small rectangular pit near Orchard Run, excavated to a floor depth of 4 feet, which has been dated between 1607 and 1625 by associated cultural objects. This small pit, without structural brick, was a brick-making clamp, consisting of unfired brick built up over 2 firing chambers. There is good evidence that a pottery kiln was situated 30 feet west of the industrial area. Ironworking pits. Also in the industrial area, near Pitch and Tar Swamp, there is a circular pit in which lime, bog iron, and charcoal suggest the manufacture of iron. The previously mentioned pit within the area of the Confederate fort yielded sword parts, gun parts, bar iron, and small tools, indicating a forge site, perhaps an armorer's forge. Illustration caption. Making pottery at Jamestown, a conjectural sketch by Sidney E. King. End of caption. Another illustration caption. How an ironworking pit was used, from contemporary sources. End of caption. Another illustration caption. Cross-section of a brick-cased well at Jamestown, a conjectural sketch by Sidney E. King. End of caption. Another illustration caption. One of the intriguing mysteries of Jamestown is how the left leg and left half of a human pelvis came to be thrown with other refuse into a well behind the row house. The logical inference is that a rebel or criminal had been hanged, drawn, and quartered. End of caption. Wells. At Jamestown, wells are conspicuous features near many house locations. Those that have been found may be summarized as follows. Wood-lined, 1. Circular and brick-cased, 10. Circular, uncased with wooden barrel at bottom, 6. Circular, uncased, incompletely excavated, 4. Wells are invariably found filled with earth mixed with trash, mainly food animal bones. A well, located immediately north of the row house, had a human left leg and left half of the pelvis buried in the fill at a depth of 4 feet. Ditches. The most significant feature determining land holdings are the ditches of the Jamestown area. During the 1954 to 56 explorations, 63 ditches were added to the 33 previously discovered, thus increasing the opportunity to delineate property lines, many of which used to be bounded by such ditches. Illustration caption. Careful excavation was required to identify the fill of long obliterated ditches once draining fields and marking property boundaries. End of caption. Refuse pits. James City, like all other settlements in all ages, had to have places for disposal of refuse. That much refuse was disposed of by casting it in the James River is unlikely, since before the dawn of history it has been a trait of man to live on top of his own refuse, rather than litter ashore with it. While it may be that no pits were dug purposely for refuse disposal, pits open for brick or ceramic clay, or dug for ice houses, wells, or other purposes and later abandoned, were used for dumping trash. In 1955, a refuse pit almost 40 feet square was discovered in the industrial area near the workshop, ironworking pit, and pottery kilns. Filled with trash from the first half of the 17th century, this pit contained such artifacts as a swept-hilt rapier, made about 1600, a cutlass, the breastpiece and backpiece of a light suit of armor, a number of utensils of metal, ceramics, and glass, to add to the collection of early 17th century arts and crafts. Several smaller refuse pits were noted, and it is worth commenting that many ditches finally became trash accumulation areas. Illustration caption: a cutlass in excellent preservation and many other objects from 17th century Jamestown were found in a large clay borrow pit filled with refuse. End of caption. Roads. Only one road identified by 17th century references has been definitely located by archaeologists. This is the Main Cart Road, sometimes called the Great Road, leading from Glasshouse Point across the isthmus and onto the island, where it can be traced as far as its passage into the main James City area just north of the brick church and churchyard. A trace is all that remains of a road which once ran east-west between parallel ditches, south of the row house. The foregoing has been a summary of the physical aspect of the Jamestown settlement from the standpoint of archaeology. An account of the arts and crafts revealed by the artifacts found in these explorations follows. The whole story relating the settlers themselves to evidence they left in the soil of Jamestown remains to be told. End of section 1.